If you're just learning about blend modes, be prepared for your skills to get a massive level up. The knowledge in this video will be a force multiplier for your digital creative work. While this video applies to Affinity products, almost everything you learn will carry over to tons of other programs, whether it's Procreate, Premiere, Photoshop, and more. So let's learn about blend modes. What's up guys, it's Trent, and in this video we're going to go over all the blend modes in Affinity products, which includes Designer, Photo, and Publisher. Now first, a few words about how this video is organized. There's a little over 30 blend modes depending on how you count, and I've added timestamps in the description to group them into sections so you can easily jump around to what's interesting to you. Regarding the blend modes themselves, they are based on some mathematical operations, but I've tried to keep that aspect to a minimum in this video. There's a couple that are fairly simple: addition, subtraction, and multiplication, and I'll talk about them where it makes sense and clarifies things, but in general you don't really have to have a deep math background to understand how blend modes work at all. Finally, in terms of how I got the information for this video, a lot of it came from reading about Photoshop blend modes. Affinity themselves haven't published too much information on how the blend modes actually work, but it's kind of the same across multiple programs. There are a few Affinity specific blend modes that I couldn't actually figure out the math to, but I show examples in this video to help you actually see practically how they work. So with that out of the way, let's do a refresher course on what blend modes actually are and how to use them before we look at them one by one. A blend mode is a setting that determines how a layer interacts with the layer beneath it. Now that may sound kind of strange. I mean, don't we just stack layers on top of each other? What else is there to know? But actually, by using blend modes, we can get really interesting effects with how the layers interact with each other. So let's look at an example here. I downloaded this paper texture from Creative Fabrica. Let's say we want to make an asset for a video game or something. Maybe we want to make this like a letter that the player finds in the world. Maybe we want to make it seem like this letter has some type of watercolor flower stamps on it. So I got these flowers here, so let's put them on the letter. You can see they're over the paper here, and it looks kind of plain, but watch what happens if I change the blend mode. Let's say something like color burn. Look how it kind of blends in better now. I can do that with the other one also. Color burn. It almost looks like it's like an ink stamp or something like that. I found this coffee stain. Let me put that over here. And it looks pretty good by default, but if I select it on my coffee layer here, I can change the blend mode. Let's try multiply. And you can see it actually looks a little darker. It looks a little more realistic that way. I also have this letter text, so let's put that in here. I can resize it. And something you might even do in this case is just randomly select the blend modes and see which one looks good. Now, as you scroll through them, you'll get the preview of what they do on the left here, actually on your image. I think color burn looks kind of cool, so let's do that. So here's a final result. I also added some curves and some levels adjustments. You can check out my video on adjustment layers if you want to get some ideas on how to use those. But I think this looks a little more interesting than if we just put the plain graphics on top of this paper texture. So this kind of gives you a little idea of what we can do with blend modes. But let's look a little deeper now into how to actually use blend modes and how they work. Now when you think about blend modes, what you want to think about is the blend layer and the base layer. So in this example, I'm going to use my flowers here as the base layer, and you can see they're below the gray square. So let me click the gray square and I'll move it over my flowers. And the gray square's blend mode is normal right now. So what happens is what you expect. It just blocks out the content below it. But if I go and I select the multiply mode, you can see that now it's making the area below it darker. And you don't have to know why it's darker now. We'll explain multiply later, but just know that that's the effect that this blend mode is having. So our top layer here is the blend layer set to multiply. And if you want to put it back to normal, you can go and select normal. So what happens is that the pixels on our blend layer are being matched with the corresponding one beneath it on the base layer. And then they go through some blend formula, and the output is what you see. There are about 32 blend modes in Affinity products, but don't let that number scare you. Most of them are kind of common sense, and a lot of them are related to each other. So once you know a few, the others are easier to learn, as I'll show you as we go through the video. And most likely you'll find 5 or 6 that are kind of your favorites and you keep going back to for common operations. Let's also do a quick review of how pixels work, just because we're going to be talking a lot about RGB over the course of this video, so it's nice to have a baseline in that. Now when you look at your displays, you're essentially looking at red, green, and blue colors packed really tightly together to give you a whole spectrum of other colors that you can see. And here I have some pictures of what the screens look like when you zoom in. Some of these are CRT, so you're not really going to notice that anymore. And the resolution is so high on devices these days that it's really hard to see the RGB pixels. But if you look in close enough, you'll see that they're there. Now in terms of what I call pixel anatomy, we can think of each color as having a red, green, and blue component. And these are called the channels. So there's a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And each of these channels can have values in the range of 0 to 255 because that's a byte of data, but we don't need to go into those types of details. So when you look at colors, they're just some combination of red, green, and blue values. So here we have a purple, a yellow, kind of a light green. So this purple is 122 red, 67 green, and 201 blue. And something I do very often is use the color picker just to see what color a certain part of the screen is. So I'm in Affinity Designer now. If you click this button here and drag it over, it'll show you what the color is under your cursor. And if you see here, indeed that purple is 122, 67, 201. The yellow is 244, 222, and 29, and the green would be this. So you're always going to see some triplet of RGB numbers in the range of 0 to 255 that represent your colors. Now you don't have to know exactly what the numbers will give you, but there are some special ones you should know. So when all the RGB values are 0, you get black. And when all the values are 255, you get white. So something you should also know is what happens when all these numbers are the same. So what do you think will happen when red equals green equals blue? Well, the answer is you'll get some type of gray. So you get gray whenever your red, green, and blue values are all the same. So here are some examples: all 81, all 135s, all 223. And if I open up the color picker here, this whole left edge of the color square is going to be our grayscale. So if I hold the mouse cursor at the edge, when I drag along the side, notice how the RGB values are all the same. So I can go up and down. All the way to the bottom is 0. The middle is going to be somewhere around 128. And the top is white, which is 255 all across. So far these are the situations where we actually can say what the colors are just by looking at the numbers. Our blacks are all 0, our white is all 255s, and we see our red, green, and blue here, which is just 255 in the channel. And red equals green equals blue is going to be some type of gray. Now there's one other scenario we should know about, which is what happens when we take the complement of these red, green, and blue values. For example, what happens if we have 0, 255, 255? Well, in that situation, we get our cyan, magentas, and yellows. So cyan is going to be the complement of red, magenta is the complement of green, and yellow is the complement of blue. So these are the ones that are useful to know. You don't have to memorize them right this instant, but as time goes on, it's kind of useful to remember this relationship. Now, another way of looking at colors is through their HSL value, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminosity. Now, it's important to understand that this data is 100% derived from RGB values. The color just has an RGB value. HSL is just kind of another way of looking at it. Kind of like the way you have Celsius and Fahrenheit can be different numbers, but they still represent the same value. So here I have this red square, and the RGB value is 255, 0, 0, but the HSL is actually 0, 150. And if I open my color picker here, you can see the HSL listed here. So it's saying the hue is 0, saturation is 100, and lightness is 50. This can be useful because sometimes when you're adjusting numbers for a color, it's easier to adjust the hue or saturation or lightness if you want to change something. For example, if I have my hue here, I can change it, and you can see just the color is changing, but the saturation and lightness are the same. That would be really hard to do just by changing the RGB values. Similarly, if I want to change the lightness, I can make it brighter or darker. You can see this square here. I can do that just by adjusting the lightness. Now, I'm not going to go into the numbers of HSL as much as I did with RGB, but one thing that's useful to know is that a hue of 0 equals 0 degrees on the color wheel, which is red. So here I have a color wheel and my hue is 0, and you can see it's pointing at red. What I can do is I can say plus 90 to take a 90-degree step. And you can see it went 90 degrees down below. If I go back to 0, if I do 180, 0 plus 180, that's completely on the other side of the circle. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that this is cyan. That's what we said earlier, that red is the opposite of cyan. So this is kind of useful to know, but you don't need to go too crazy with knowing exactly what these values mean. Now, there is one other channel in addition to RGB, and that is the alpha channel, sometimes called A. So you may see this A listed after RGB sometimes. That stands for alpha, which means transparency. I won't talk about the alpha channel too much in this video. We will use opacity, but it's not really a mathematical consideration for many of the situations we'll look at. But if you do see it, just know that that's what it's referring to. And here we have an example. So when alpha is fully 255, you have a solid object here. And as it decreases to say 191 or 128, you see it get lighter and lighter. So things behind it start to show through it a little bit more. So it's good to call out, but we're not going to use it too much here in this video. So we looked at RGB color and reviewed some of the special values for them, and also did a quick look at how HSL works. Now let's actually start looking at the blend modes, and we'll start with the darken modes. So let's start with the darken modes, and as you can guess, they all darken our images, but they do it in a slightly different way, which we'll explore here. And to begin with, we can look at multiply. Multiply is one of the most used blend layers of all. It's very common for darkening parts of an image or an entire image itself. Now to give this demo here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my blend layer copy and the original image up top so you can see what they looked like originally. And let's see the effect multiply has. So right now I don't have anything set for this blend layer. Let's just move it over our image here. And I'll set the blend mode to multiply. So you can see, of course, that it's getting darker here. And by the way, one thing to note is that the white part of my template here is not having any effect on the image. So this is something that's common to all the blend modes in the darken family. White doesn't darken the image below it. So if I drag this to the side a little bit, you can see the white part is still the same. And for multiply, pure black will completely make our layer below it pure black. Let's look at how multiply acts with a color template. So I have this color template here. It's set to normal. Let me just move it over my image and I'll set it to multiply. And you can see it's still having this darkening effect and the color is influencing it somewhat also. So the term multiply kind of hints at some mathematical basis for this. I do think this is one of the ones that's useful to know a little bit of the math behind it. So let's look at that now. So here I have an example of a blend layer above my base layer, and this blend layer, this blue, is being set to multiply, and you can see the result it's having here in the middle. Now what does this multiply word mean, and why does it make things darker? What multiply does is it looks at the RGB values of your blend layer, and it converts them on a scale of 0 to 100%. So for example, 255 is 100% because that's the max value we can have in our channel. 127 is 50%. And 64 is 25% of the full value we can have. So this is our base layer down here. Well, 35 times 100%, we get 35 in the result. 144 times 50%, well, that gives us 72. And 25% of 210 is 53. So that's really the way the math behind multiply works. It's normalizing your RGB values on a scale of 0 to 100 and then multiplying the layer below it by those values. Let's look at another way we could use multiply. So here I have this image of a house, and I'm in Affinity Photo now, but this is kind of similar in all the programs. And it's an image. Let me add a pixel layer so I don't destroy my image. And what I can do is I can select a brush. And if I want to make it darker, I can just kind of put black around it. But I mean, this is not really good. You can see what's happening here. So let's undo that. What I can do is I can set this layer to multiply. And now if I pick something like a middle gray here, I'm using the brush, I can actually paint over my sky and start making it darker. And this is kind of quick just to show you the point, but this gives you an idea of what we could do. So the more black I choose, the darker it's going to be. So perhaps I can make the bottom parts even a little bit darker here. If it's a little bit too dark, you can actually choose a lighter color and then paint back over it. Or you could totally erase it, of course. Going full white would erase it, if you don't want to use the eraser. Sometimes it's quicker to go back and forth between different levels of gray than it is to erase things. So this is one quick and dirty result I did here. So let's look at before, after, before, after. Now if I was going to take this further, I'd do a little more details here, but this kind of gives you an idea of what's possible with this blend mode. So very useful for adding shadows into things. Now let's look at two blend modes that are closely related, darken and darker color. The names are confusingly similar, so I wanted to look at them together so we could actually determine what the difference is. So if we look at them closely, can you see what the possible difference is between these two blend modes? Both of them are trying to find the darker component of the image, whether it's on the top blend layer or the layer below it, the base layer. However, darker color is going to pick the entire pixel, while darken is going to mix channels. Let me zoom into darker color, and I think it'll be a little more obvious. So if we zoom in, you're probably noticing that in darker color here, which is what I'm looking at now, everything is very strictly separated. Especially in this cloud area, you see very stark differences between the sky and the clouds. Down here in the trees, you see these differences. Over here on the roof, you see very sharp edges. So what's happening with darker color, it's either choosing the entire pixel on the top layer or the entire pixel on the bottom layer. So if I turn it off, if I zoom into the roof, you can actually see that the best. Notice how it's choosing the exact colors of the bottom layer when I toggle on and off. And for the sky, it's choosing the exact colors of the gray layer above. Darken, on the other hand, is choosing them channel by channel. So when you go and zoom in, It's actually looking inside the pixels and making the decision based on the individual channels. So in that case, darken is giving us a more evenly mixed result as opposed to these harsh differences we're getting with darker color. So to give a more detailed answer, remember darken is the one that's giving us the channel by channel comparison with the more evenly blended result. Over here I have a blend layer above the base layer. For our blend layer we have the channels 64, 127, 255. Our base layer is 200, 127, 75. So you can see our result here. Darken is just going to choose the lesser of the red, green, and blue channels individually. So 64 is less than 200, so we get that. 127 is the same as 127, so we just pick one. And 75 is less than 255, so we get the 75 over here. And this is the way darken is blending the layers together. So something I like to do is put the layers above each other and kind of just randomly change the color on the color wheel to see what the result is. You will notice that if our top layer is like really light, we get the entire bottom layer showing through. Other times it's more of a mix. And this kind of goes with what we know because of how the channels work. Now darker color, as we said, is going to choose either the entire top color or the entire bottom color. It's not going to mix them, it's just going to choose one or the other. And here I have an example of that. The example isn't that interesting to begin with, but let me choose my top layer here, which is set to darker color. And as I move the color wheel around, you'll notice there are moments where it just kind of jumps to the bottom color because now the bottom layer becomes darker. So this jump there, here's another jump. And it's a little hard to predict almost. So a question you may ask is, how do we know which color is actually darker? It's not really that obvious when you think about it. Is there some mathematical value? Well, it turns out there is. So let's look at the luminosity calculation. This is going to come up in a couple places throughout this video. So let's start what I would call the naive luminosity calculation. Let's say we assume luminosity is just the sum of the RGB values. Well, here I have green, which is 0, 255, 0. And here I have a blue, but it's a little bit slightly brighter than normal blue. It has 10 red, 10 green, and 255 blue. So if I add up the RGB values, well, for our green we get 255, for our blue we get 275. So technically our blue is lighter than our green. So this means our green is darker. But does it actually seem darker? I think most people would agree that this green actually seems even brighter than our blue here, even though the sum of the values is less than the blue. So due to this fact that green usually appears lighter and blue appears darker, we actually use a weighted algorithm for adding up the red, green, and blue values. So that leads to our improved luminosity formula, and this is something that's used throughout the industry to convert color to black and white and to make things seem more realistic when doing lighting calculations. The values slightly change between algorithms, but usually you see 0.3 red, 0.59 green, and 0.11 blue. So if we use this formula to create luminosity, what we get for our green is that our green has a luminosity of 150, and our blue has a luminosity of 28. So with this formula, even though they have the same numbers for RGB, with the weighted formula, we get green being higher in luminosity, and that makes sense based on what we see. So this goes back to our darker color example, and it's essentially doing the same thing. I won't show the math here, but it's calculating the luminosity for the top layer and comparing it to the luminosity for the bottom layer. And using that weighted algorithm, it's much more realistic based on what our eyes actually see. We'll see this again later on in the video with the lighten blend modes. So just to summarize this section again, I'll show it with the color templates. You can again see darken blending things quite nicely, and darker color having a much more harsher edge to things. If we zoom in closely, you'll see it much more clearly. It's obviously choosing either the entire top pixel or the entire bottom pixel. And then if I go to darken, it's blending in a little cleaner. Now let's look at color burn and linear burn, and these are another two that it's kind of nice to look at together because it gives more of an example of how they differ from each other. And I've also put multiply up here because that's one most people are more familiar with, and I wanted to show the difference in saturation levels between these three modes. So on the left here we have color burn, and particularly if you compare the middle of color burn with the middle of linear burn, you'll see color burn is much better at maintaining those saturation levels. And we get that a lot with the blue sky here and also the highlights on the castle. Linear burn, on the other hand, doesn't respect saturation as much, and that kind of goes with the name linear burn. It's kind of linearly applying this darkening effect left to right, whereas color burn is boosting up the middle a little bit more. So I've covered this castle image with a layer that's this kind of orange here, and you can definitely see that the color burn is helping us bring out these highlights a little bit more, whereas linear burn is just a much more even color all the way through. Now often with these blend modes you don't want to go full blast on full opacity, although you can, but what I'll do is I'll toggle the opacity here a little bit. So you don't have to go full speed ahead with all these blend modes all the time. You can certainly dial the opacity down to something that's a little easier to take. So wrapping up the darken modes, here they all are side by side. Certainly multiply is probably the most commonly used. Color burn is also very popular in the dodge and burn technique, which we'll talk about later. And remember the difference between darken and darker color. Darken is going to choose channel by channel, whereas darker color is going to use a weighted luminosity calculation to choose an entire pixel. And then we have linear burn down below, which is kind of like color burn, but doesn't maintain saturation as well. And once again, in all these examples, I've had the top layer at 100% opacity, but that's something that's possible to change. Okay, we spent enough time in the dark. Now let's look at the other side of the spectrum, the lighten modes. Now the good news is that if you understand the darken modes, the lighten modes are basically the same, they're just the opposite. So let's start with screen, which is the opposite of multiply. Here we have our castle example again, and what I'll point out in this case is that notice how the black is having no effect, and that's going to be the case with our lighten modes. The black value isn't going to change anything. On the white side, however, you can see that total white is going to make our base layer completely white. And in the middle, we have this kind of gradual effect. So the math for screen is more complicated than multiply, so I won't talk about it too much, but again, a good exercise is to select your blend layer and just kind of move the colors around and see what happens. So totally white is going to go completely white. And I can go down, black isn't going to do anything. And if you move around, the hue will have some effect on the resulting blend. Now here's a cool demo using the screen blend mode. I have this background image here, and let me move my moon over my image. And what I'll do is I'll set the blend mode to screen. So I'll go here and select screen. And what we can see is that the black basically disappears and I'm left with my moon here. And I can rotate it. I can change the opacity a little bit if that's too strong. So one nice situation to use screen for is if you have a bright object on a black background, if you put it as screen against another surface, the black was going to disappear. Another use for screen is to add highlights or glowing effects to your image. Here's the house I darkened in the multiply section, so this was before, after. I'll add another pixel layer here, and I'll set it to screen. And maybe what I want to do is add some glowing effects around the lights that are on this house. So what I can do is I can select my paintbrush. I'll select like some type of yellow here. And again, we don't have to go super bright because it's going to be bright anyway. We can even go darker. And if I hover over here, maybe I'll hover over the lights. Just give it a little bit of an effect there. So this is before, after, before, after. And I can adjust the transparency, the opacity a little bit. So this is an example of using screen in our image. Now we'll look at lighten and lighter color. And these are the opposites of darken and darker color. So looking at these two blend modes, do you think you can see the difference? I'll give you a hint, which is look at the sudden cutoffs in lighter color and see how lighten is kind of more gradually blended in. So yes, the difference is the same as darken and darker color. Lighten is going to blend the channels individually, and lighter color is going to choose either the top or bottom pixel, whichever is lighter. So just to review, lighten will pick the higher value of the RGBs when making the result. So here we have our blend layer. 200 is the base layer below, so it's going to have 200 in the result. 127s are the same in both the base and the blend, so it picks 127. And 255 is higher than 75, so that's going to go into our result. Lighter color, on the other hand, is going to use the luminosity calculation to pick which color feels lighter, for lack of a better term, and it's going to show that one in total. So I've put them side by side, and we can see what happens when I adjust the color here. So with lighten, you're getting this blend of the two of them, and with lighter color, you'll see that it's going to choose either one or the other. So let's move it around. Lighter color is flipping back and forth here, depending on how light I make the top level, whereas lighten is going to mix the two colors together. So to put it all together, you can see that lighten and darken are kind of in the same family, but doing the opposite of each other. Lighten is going to be gradually lighting towards the right, darken gradually darkening towards the left, whereas lighter color and darker color are doing pixel by pixel comparisons, and the result are much harsher cutoffs. Color dodge can be thought of as the opposite of color burn. For now, we'll just look at a basic example, but later on we'll do a more detailed demo of dodging and burning. What we can see pretty obviously is that color dodge gets bright very fast. And in fact, you're probably not going to go pure white in a lot of situations. You're probably going to be more in the mid-tone when you're dodging something. Here's another example where I have the blend layer on top and the result is in the middle. And let me change the blend layer. You can see that it goes to full white pretty quickly. So a little bit of dodging goes very far. Add is often called linear dodge in many programs, and it's another one that gets white very quickly. So we can see an example here with our castle demo. The math is so simple with this one, we just have to take a look. So let's go over to that slide. And what you can see is that add is literally just adding each channel and putting it in the result. So if our blend layer has 50 for red and our base layer has 100, the total is 150. 25 plus 200 is 225. And 150 plus 200 is 350. But since that goes outside of our bounds, it just gets capped at 255. And that's really all add is doing. So those are our lighten modes, and this section was quicker than the darken section because so much of the same information carried over. Lighten and lighter color were the same as darken and darker color. Screen is the opposite of multiply. Color dodge related to color burn, and linear dodge related to linear burn. Now let's take a break from the blend modes themselves right now, and let's actually look at a specific use case of dodging and burning. So let's take a step back and look at how we actually would use blend modes in practice. And in this case, we'll look at a dodge and burn demo. So I have an image here, and it's kind of a typical type of image you would use for this situation. It's a portrait, it's going to be a photo touch-up job. And what we can do is we can use what we know about dodging and burning to add some extra life to this photo. So by the way, I'm in Affinity Photo, but this would also work in Affinity Designer's pixel persona. We want to work non-destructively when we do blend modes. So let's first add a pixel layer. And what I'll do is I'll set this to color dodge. Now, if you get confused about the difference between dodging and burning, I always remember that burning makes things darker and dodge is the other one. So that's kind of how I remember it. But I'll call this color dodge for my layer so it's clear. And then what I'll do is I'll select a brush, and let's see what kind of brush I have on the end of it. Something soft is usually what I do. Now I'm on the color dodge layer. And with color dodge, this is going to make our image lighter. Now if I go to something very white, you can see this is my current color here. I'm just selecting something close to the white point. It's going to be very extreme. So obviously we don't want that. So with dodge, typically you can choose something really close to the black side of things. I'll zoom in. So we can see it is having a lightening effect. Let me turn it off and on. So this is on, off, on, off. So put it back on. I'll get a little more of this Rembrandt triangle over here. That's what we call this angle on the cheek here. It's very popular in Rembrandt's paintings. And if you ever decide you went overboard, you can always change the opacity of the whole layer. So this is 0%, it's just our original image. And then if I go back to 100%, that's my normal painting. So let me just put this layer on normal so you can see what I did. This is what it looks like in normal mode. Obviously not good, but it kind of gives you an idea of how we painted it in. I'll go back to color dodge. And I'll just continue adding highlights here. This is where you get to kind of make artistic choices of what you think should be emphasized. I can brighten up the arm a little bit too. Now the effect is going to depend on the color of the base layer too. So as you go through a image, you may need to change the color on your brush. So I did some touch-ups here. Let's see what our result looks like. So before, after. Before, after. Let's now do a color burn layer. So I'll add a new pixel layer. I'll set it to color burn. I'll call it color burn. Now with color burn, a dark color is going to just be very strong. So of course we don't want that. So we want to kind of start at the white end and maybe just back it off a little bit into a little bit of gray here. So let's zoom in and see what that's doing. It is still like really strong, so let's make it even more white. I'll even turn down the opacity a bit just because this one seems to be so strong. We can make the background darker if we like. If you want, you could even make some lost edges here, so make the background and the arm kind of blend into each other. So here's my end result, and I'll show you the before and after. So this is before, after, before, after. And really all we did was create two new pixel layers and give them each the different blend modes, so color dodge and color burn. But that's a quick crash course on how you can do dodge and burning with blend layers. So now let's get back to the blend modes themselves, and we'll look at the contrast modes. So I have more good news for you, and that is that as we look at the contrast modes, this is again going to draw upon the knowledge we got in the darken and lighten modes. Because what the contrast modes essentially do is they combine a lighten and darken mode into one blend mode itself. So let's take a look at an example here. We looked at burn and dodge in the last section, and remember that burn makes something darker the darker you go, and dodge is going to make something lighter the lighter we go. So in the contrast mode, we have something called vivid light, and what that does is it combines color dodge and color burn together. So essentially it stacks the color dodge effect in the top half of the value range, and it takes the color burn effect and puts it in the bottom half of the value range. And that's generally going to be the pattern for most of the modes that we see in this section. And that's really the definition of contrast, something that will increase our lights and decrease our darks. So to give you an example here, I have this rectangle of value, and let's put it over here under color burn. I'll set it to color burn. And we can see it has the predictable effect that we saw last section. And let's copy it again over here, and let's call this color dodge. So I'll set this to color dodge. Now let's do it one more time, and I'll set it to vivid light. Now let me stretch this out a little more. What this is doing is essentially it's taking our color burn and putting it at the halfway point here. And it's taking our color dodge and using it to fill the top half. And you can see we're essentially getting the same effect here. When we took color burn, put it on the bottom, took color dodge, put it on the top, and that's what our vivid light is doing. So this was a quick example. Let's dive deeper into one of the more popular blend modes, overlay. What overlay is going to do is combine the screen and multiply modes. But there's one key difference, and that is that it's actually going to take the value of the base layer, the layer below it. So let me move this color around of the base layer. You can see as I make it lighter, the intersection is lighter. And then as I make it darker, the intersection is becoming darker. Now you may wonder why this is the case, but in practice it ends up being more convenient when we're working with images. Let's go back to this image here, and this is the one that I touched up with the screen and multiply blend modes. So I had my screen layer doing some lights, and I had my multiply just adding some dramatic shadows here to show a difference. Let me add a layer for overlay. So I'll call it overlay, and I'll set it to overlay. Now remember with overlay, if you're in the middle with this kind of gray here, you're not going to have much of an effect. So I can draw all over my image, and you're not really seeing anything. But if I go into the darker side, now I'm making the area beneath it darker. And if I go to the lighter side, things can become lighter. So I'll make these lights lighter. Maybe I'll lighten up the windows a little bit. Now what you'll really notice with the overlay tool is we are preserving the colors on the bottom layer much better. So notice how this is all green in here. I'm getting these greens when I add this light in. And you saw that with the sky too. When I added darkness to the sky, it preserved this blue. Let me add a multiply layer right next to it just so you can see the difference. So I'll say multiply. I'll set it to multiply. Now I'm doing essentially the same value on my paintbrush, but you can see that multiply is giving a much duller effect. And this is the result of the bottom blend layer being used with the overlay, whereas the top blend layer is being used with multiply. So there is a different effect happening when you use overlay versus just using multiply and screen on two separate layers. Now let's look at hard light, which is like overlay, except it actually does use the top layer as the blend value. So this kind of literally is like real screen on top of real multiply in the truest sense. So here in this example, if I select my blend layer, if I select the different colors, you are going to see the blend layer having the effect. So when the blend layer is lighter, the intersection, the result is lighter. When the blend layer is darker, the intersection is going to be darker. And if I select my base layer, well here, I can make it as light as I want, but it's not going to help because the top layer is having the darkening effect. So hard light is like screen and multiply in the truest sense. Now we can go back to this example here. Remember, this was my overlay layer. If I copy my overlay layer, let's call it hard light, and let's set it to hard light. And now you'll see, well, the screen part looks horrible, but you can see that in the sky, the darken part looks exactly like our multiply section here because it is acting the same as multiply. So if you wanted to use screen and multiply in one layer as they truly behave normally, you would use the hard light for that. So putting overlay and hard light side by side, you can really see that overlay is doing a better job of preserving those colors. And hard light is getting a little grayer, which is what we saw earlier with multiply having the same effect, getting kind of grayer. Now let's look at soft light, which is one of my favorite blend modes for adding a little bit of punch to images. Despite the name, soft light doesn't really have any relation to hard light. Soft light is actually more of a gentler version of overlay. And the simplest way to explain this blend mode is really just with a demo here. What I like to do is, I like to take an image and let's copy it. And what you can do is you can set the blend mode of the top image to soft light. And by default, it just adds a little bit more vibrancy to your image. Let's look at that before and after again. So this is before, after, before, after. So all we did was duplicate the image and then give it the blend mode soft light, which it used to blend with the layer below. And it can add this nice effect here. And if it's too strong, you can of course change the opacity back and forth, but I think 100% opacity is pretty good. Now, if you're trying to learn the blend modes, this is actually a good trick you can do with a lot of them is duplicate a layer and give it the blend mode and just see how the layer interacts with itself. Sometimes there'll be no interaction. Sometimes they'll be negative and completely cancel each other out. And sometimes you'll have a cool effect like this. Now, if you don't like copying a layer like this, here's a quick tip you can do in Affinity Designer and Photo to help reduce that kind of redundancy here. So let's just review. I had this image of soft light on top of its duplicate here, which was normal. Let me delete the soft light one. And to create that same effect, what we can do is with the image, we can add an adjustment layer. And we can just say something like curves. And we don't even have to make any change. We can actually just change the blend mode here. And we can choose soft light. And I'll close this. And that is really the same as doing what we did the other way, where we copied the layer and gave it the soft light blend mode. So this way is a little bit better, I think, because you're not duplicating the image and it's a little cleaner to me. So we can toggle the curve on and off. And again, the curve in this case isn't doing anything. It's just the straight line curve. But because we added the blend mode soft light, it's the same as just applying the image to itself with a blend mode. So that's a little trick that comes in handy when you want to keep your workspace more organized. So once again, putting these contrast modes that we've looked at so far side by side, I put soft light in the middle here. You can see it is more similar to overlay than it is hard light. Not really any relation to hard light. And soft light is just kind of a gentler version of the overlay. If you look at these blues, you can see they're not quite as saturated over here. So it's a nice blend mode to apply that doesn't really require a lot of thought. You can just turn it on and it makes your colors just jump a little bit more. Now we look at vivid light in the introductory section, so I won't go too much into detail here, but just remember this is going to be color burn and color dodge on top of each other. And with my black and white template here, you can see it's a very strong effect, which is what we saw with color burn and color dodge to begin with. Likely this is one where you're going to want to play with the opacity a little bit, so if you are going to use vivid light on something, you can kind of turn down the effect. Or you can choose values that are more in that mid-tone range and aren't going to be as extreme. Linear light is going to be add on top, which is also called linear dodge, and linear burn on the bottom. Now to refresh your memory, I've added a screenshot of what add and linear burn did here. Remember that these ones have much less contrast than their cousin ones, color dodge and color burn. So with add on my top range of values is very white and blown out. Linear burn on the bottom range is going to be very dark. And remember, color burn had really bright highlights here. And if we look at linear light here, we can see that yes, on the darker side, we're not getting a lot of contrast. Same thing with the brighter side. So if you're a fan of linear dodge and linear burn and you want them in one blend mode, you can use linear light. Pin light combines the lighten and darken modes. And remember that lighten and darken make decisions on a channel by channel basis. So it's possible that our result will be a totally new color. So I can move around the blend layer and we can see the effect it's having. Sometimes the result is totally different. And sometimes we do get one layer chosen over the other. Now, as far as I can tell, pin light is definitely one of the lesser used blend modes. I couldn't find a lot of information about it. I did see some people say it could be useful for special effects, so I have an example here. I have some bokeh lights on the left here and kind of a scene on the right. So let me take this layer, and it's normal, but I'll just put it right over my image. And I'll set it to pin light. You can see it is kind of cool. I don't know if it's the best blend layer effect, but it's something. I think this is a classic example of one of those blend modes that you can just try, see if it looks good, and if not, move on to one of the other ones. Finally, we come to hard mix, which behaves a little bit differently than the other contrast blend modes. Unlike the others, this one doesn't combine a lighten and darken mode. It kind of does something different. Let's see if you can guess what it does. So here I have a base image on the right, and I have this gradient on the left, and it is set to hard mix. Let me move it over my image, and let's zoom in and see if you can guess what it does. So this is my new image here, hard mixed. So I'll give you a hint. If you look at the colors, do you notice anything special about these colors? Well, they're all CMYK or RGB. So our colors are limited to red, green, and blue, cyan, yellow, magenta, and black, and white. And that's what hard mix does. It limits our result to that 8 color range. So here in my hard mix example, you can see the result is cyan. If I change the colors of my blend layer, you can see it makes very abrupt changes to those yellows, cyan again. It's always doing one of those 8 values. And what hard mix does is it just adds the channel values of our colors. If the result is over 255, it sets it to 255. If the result is less than 255, it sets it to 0. So the result of hard mix is that all our values are going to be somewhere in this range here, some mix of 0s and 255s. I think hard mix can definitely be cool for lots of kind of retro glitchy effects, so I'll add this here. And what I can do is with this gradient, I can rotate the color around. You can see all sorts of crazy stuff happening. It's definitely a pretty cool one to experiment with because you never really know how things are going to turn out, and that's kind of fun. So here's a summary of the contrast modes, and I have my normal gradient here. Vivid light, remember, is going to be color dodge and color burn together. Hard light is screen and multiply, but it uses the top layer value, and you're often going to get a duller effect. Whereas overlay is going to use the screen and multiply, but use the base layer's value. And overlay is really one of the most popular modes in use. And soft light is also a nice, gentler version of overlay. With linear light, we have the linear dodge and linear burn modes. And then pin light uses lighten and darken. And what hard mix is going to do is really it's just going to cap our values at those basic RGB, CMYK, and white values. Now we'll look at the comparative modes, which are also called the inversion modes. And really you can think of these modes as specializing in finding the differences between two layers. And speaking of differences, we'll start with the blend mode, difference. Difference is one of the coolest modes, and it's almost like a top secret spy tool. It can show you things in images that you otherwise wouldn't even notice. So here I have these two images, and they're exactly the same, except for one difference. So I'll give you a second. Do you think you can see what the difference is? Well, this actually becomes really easy with the difference blend mode. So I'll take my image on the left, and I'll put it on top of my image on the right, and I'll change the blend mode to difference. And now we can see what the difference is. There's a change here. And actually, if I put my difference mode back to normal, you can see as I toggle on and off, this is in fact where the difference is. So difference is really good at showing slight alterations between images. It can also be used for panoramas. So for example, here I have a scene of a desert. And let's say I want to put this other scene in the correct place. Well, what I can do is I can put it to the difference mode. So let me move it over here, and I'll select the difference. And I can try to gradually resize it so it matches the image below it. Now when they match perfectly, it will be completely black. And it might not match perfectly because these are different photos, but let's see if we can get as close as possible. One tip is also to turn off snapping when you're trying to do this, because sometimes that can make it more difficult. And here we can see that we're pretty well aligned because there's lots of black here, which means that things are lining up pretty well. When things line up well, the difference between them is black. So I put it back into normal mode, and we can see we got it lined up pretty well thanks to difference. Now the math behind difference is actually really simple, so it's worth showing. It's going to subtract the channels from each other and take the absolute value. For example, our blend layer has 50 in the red channel, and our base layer has 100 there. Well, the difference between them is 50. Similarly, 25 and 100, the difference is 175. And the difference between 200 and 150 is 50. Now exclusion is very similar to difference, but it's going to have less contrast in the midtones. And we can see that here in our example. The edges are roughly the same, but the middle is much grayer. Now as another example, I have these images here. This pink layer is set to difference. Let's put it over our image. And this one is set to exclusion. Let's put it over our image. And again, we can see that exclusion is reducing the contrast. I can move this color around and you can see the effect it's having. And you can also try toggling the opacity here to see what kind of effects you get. Now subtract, as you may have guessed, is going to subtract the colors from each other. And I put subtract next to difference here. What you can see is with subtract, when we have a high value like white, it's going to turn black because we're subtracting a big value. White is usually in that 255 range, and that's going to give us something very small. Now it's possible to get negative values with subtract, and those are capped at 0. I do think it's worth taking a quick look at the math on this one for difference and subtract. So assume we have a layer where one value is 60 and a layer below it where the value is 40. So with difference, what we do is we take the absolute value of the difference. So 40 minus 60 is minus 20, but that just goes to positive 20. So the difference between them is 20. With subtract, we still get a negative result. 40 minus 60 is negative 20, but subtract will limit the value to be 0. So looking at this, we can see why difference still had a lot of colorful information in it and subtract didn't. Let's go back to that example. So subtract, we're getting our values set to 0 when they're negative. For difference, we're just taking the absolute value of it. Once again, let's compare them side by side. I have my base layer here of the photo. The cyan layer is set to difference. The cyan layer here is set to subtract. So you can see the way they behave differently. Let me move the colors around. So you can see with subtract, we're getting a black value for the hair, but with difference, we're getting a color. Now let's look at divide, and there's a really interesting way to use the divide blend mode. What we can use divide for is to filter out a certain color from our image and set it to the white point. So let's look at this image I have here. And let's say there's something on here I want to set as the white point. Let's say the tooth on this graphic here on the shirt. Well, I'll take my rectangle here and I'll set it to that color there. Now let me set the blend mode on this rectangle to divide. And by the way, I've made the background transparent because on a white background it would be hard to see. So if I take my rectangle and move it over my image, you'll see I've actually reset the white point. So what's the color of the tooth here? Let's check it out. It's actually white. Let's look at another example. And in this case, we can be even more extreme. Let's say I want to take out all the red of this image. Well, let me select my square. I'll select, I don't know, somewhere in the red. Now if I move it over, it takes out a lot of that red. So this can be a really cool technique for filtering color out of an image. So I won't go too crazy with the math, but I do want to point out something that I think will help build an intuition of why this works. What divide does is it takes 256 and divides it by blend divided by the base color. So you can see that whenever the blend layer and the base layer are the same, we're essentially setting it to white. And that explains why it's effectively setting this white point. So in my demo here, whenever I select the color on the blend layer that's close to my base layer, you can see it starts to go to white. So those are our 4 comparative modes. You can see they're really useful for finding the differences between images, or even setting the white point in the case of divide. Let's take another little intermission from learning about the blend modes themselves, and let's look at some of the functions and behaviors of them. First of all, how do they behave in groups? Now I have some shapes here, and you can see it's a triangle, rectangle, ellipse. I just made some simple shapes, and what I'll do is I'll group them together. So I'll Control G. Now when I expand the group, you'll notice that each of them have the ability to have a blend mode set to them, but also the group itself can have a blend mode. So let me copy this group over here, and I'll select multiply for the group's blend mode. So let's do that. Multiply. And this is the effect it's having. Now to remind you, each of these has the normal blend mode, but the group itself has multiply. So what's happening is all the objects in our group are being composited together, and then the result is being multiplied with the layer below it. Let's compare that to another situation. Let me copy this over here. I'll put the group back to pass-through. We'll explain more about that later. Now let me set each individual element to multiply. And here you can see the difference. So on the left, this was when we multiplied the whole group. On the right, this is when we did multiplying for the individual elements. So in this case, each shape is multiplying the shape below it and also multiplying the entire base layer, this image of the mountains. Okay, now let's explore this term pass-through, which you may have noticed if you've ever created a group. So I have these 2 shapes over here, and let's just create something simple. Let me just put my square on top of the circle, and I'll set its blend mode to multiply. So we have a predictable effect here, the square darken the circle. Now let me select them, and I'll hit Control G to make them a group. And we can see as my group over here, it says pass-through. And this is actually the default when you create a group. The normal scenario for a group is pass-through, despite the fact that there is a normal setting too. We'll get to that in a bit. Now when I move this group over my image, you'll see that it affects the layer below it. The square is making the image darker, and the circle is solid. So this is happening because I have it set to pass-through. So the question now is, what happens if I set it to normal? Well, let me copy it over here. So this group is my group on the right here. Instead of pass-through, let me make it normal. And now you can see what happened. And that is that the blend effect isn't passing through to the layer below it. So you can see the rectangle is still set to multiply and it's still affecting the circle, but it's not having any effect on the image below it. And with the normal blend mode on a group, you can just assume that the things in that group are being composited and then not interacting with the layers below them. Another way of thinking about it is that in the normal mode, it's almost like there's nothing below the group directly. So for example, we have these 2 groups here. Watch what happens when I disable this base layer image. The pass-through and normal mode basically look the same. So I think one scenario for this might be if you want your group to temporarily look like it doesn't have anything below it, you just want to see it in isolation. For example, if I wanted to see what this group here looked like without the image below it, I could just set the group to normal, and it gives me a preview. And then I can go back and set it to pass-through after. But just a reminder that pass-through is the default when you create a group. Now let's look at blend options. And what blend options are this little gear here. And if you click on it, what you'll see is 2 graphs like this. Now it looks a little scary at first, but I promise you it's not. We'll check it out in detail right now. So let me close this for a second. And let's say I want to put this fireball somewhere in my image. Now you may remember an earlier example when we took the moon and we put it in the sky. We set that image to a screen blend mode. And the reason it looked really nice is because the background was black. So in this case, we have basically the same scenario. The background is pretty much black for our image here. Let's set it to screen. And it looks pretty good, but there's a little bit of a problem here. You can see we have this edge here because our background wasn't totally black. It had a little bit of a tint to it. So we're kind of seeing where the edge of our image here is. Well, this is where blend options come into play. So I'll select my image and I'll click on this gear here. Now what happens is that there's two graphs here. One is the source layer range and the other is the range that you're going to blend into on the layer below it. So left to right is your value range. So this would be your blacks on this side, and over here would be your lighter colors. And going up and down is how much of the blend effect you're going to do. So you can see right now we have a straight line across the top. So that's just the default 100% across the value range. So our screen effect is being applied equally across all the lights and darks of our source layer and our bottom layer. But if you notice, the edge of our image, it was darker here. So what I can do is I can reduce the dark side of it. And if I click off, you'll notice that that line is faded a little bit. And in fact, I can get it to fade a little bit more. Let's drag it down here. You can see it's basically gone. We don't have that seam anymore. And because what we did is we reduced the effect of the darker colors. So all that darker edge got removed. Now I can also make this part stronger. Let me boost this up a little bit. In fact, in a situation like this, probably what we want is just a simple step curve. One thing you can do to smooth adjustments out is also toggle this linear function. So you can add a little bit more of a curve here. It didn't really do much of a difference in this case, but some situations it does. So now we have this kind of cool fireball and we were able to get rid of that edge. There's some other settings on this like the gamma. Basically you can just kind of play with it and see if it looks good. But really the key thing is understanding how this curve works here. What we did is we removed all the darker parts of our source image and we left the brighter parts. So now let's look at that other side of the blend options graph, and I have an example here with some text on a background. And I know this color doesn't go well with that background. I did that on purpose just so you can see the difference in them. So let's look at this here. Now let's say we want the background to shine through the text a little bit. Well, one thing we can do is we can just reduce the opacity. That doesn't really look too great. It just kind of makes the text look duller and doesn't really enhance the values behind it. So let me put that back to normal. So what I can do is I can work with the blend options of this text. So let's click blend options. And in this situation, we're going to work on the right side. And what the right side is saying is, how do you want the text to blend based on the layer value below it? So let's just show an example. Let me zoom in. For example, I can tell the text, don't blend into the bright spots of the color below it. So if I reduce this, and I move this up, you'll see what's happening is it's saying blend 0% on the high range of the colors below it. So below where you have these bright colors like this dot here, you'll see that shines through. Because it's saying when things are bright below it, don't blend into it. When things are dark below, blend 100%. So if I go down to this bottom part, my text is going to be very much there because everything is in the dark range underneath it. When I move up, I'm getting less because a lot of the stuff is in the brighter range and it's saying reduce the blend to 0% there. So this type of blend option is a really common situation when you want to have text interact with the background behind it. And the reason I chose this color was just so you could see the contrast between the bright red on top and what's actually coming through on the layer below it. So in a lot of situations you might have this text be white, so let's make it look white. You can get these really strange looks going. Sometimes it's fun just to like play with this curve and see what it looks like. But you can see that this top one is using our blend options and this bottom one was using just our opacity at 50%. And I think this bottom one looks a little more boring. I think the top one looks kind of cooler. And again, that's due to the blend options we've chosen for it. So that's a summary of how groups, pass-through, and also blend options work. For groups, it does matter whether the group itself or each individual object inside of it has the blend mode applied. For pass-through, the default for groups is to have a pass-through blend mode, but you can set it to normal and that'll basically be like having the blend mode just interact with a blank background. It can be a useful setting to toggle on and off if you want to see what your group is doing in isolation. And then blend options can be a really nice way to adjust the value range of where the blend effects are actually being applied. It can be cool for dealing with special effects or even just dealing with text. So let's go back to our blend mode list and we'll pick up with the component modes. The component modes deal with the components of our color, such as hue, saturation, and luminosity. So before we look at these modes in too much depth, let's do a quick little review of what hue, saturation, and luminosity mean. So I have an example of these terms here, and you can see that hue is what we normally call the color of something, the red, green, blue, and so on. Now, how strong that color appears away from gray is going to be the saturation level. So when a color is totally desaturated, we get something in the gray range. When it's fully saturated, we get that strongest version of the color. And luminosity is where it is on the spectrum between black and white. Now, just as a quick reminder, in Affinity programs, when you click on the color circle here, you can see the RGB values, and you can also see the HSL values next to it. And remember that the underlying data is RGB. HSL is just another way of viewing it. So whenever I change an HSL value, you'll see the RGB also changes, and vice versa. Let's start with the hue blend mode. Now, I have this image of a car. It's very red, obviously. And what I did ahead of time is I drew a shape to cover all the red. And this is just a pixel layer. I just painted it in with the selection tool. There are many ways to do this, but this is just a quick and dirty version of it. So I covered over the red part. And I made this color kind of this green with a little bit of blue in it. Now, what I can do now with this pixel layer is I can actually change the blend mode to hue. So let's do that. And now you can see the car actually looks like that color. If I wanted, I could select my paintbrush and I could actually choose some other colors. Maybe I want it to be this pink. So now we have a pink car. Now what's interesting is, notice when I have a color selected here, watch if I select something really dark and I paint over it, nothing is happening. And the reason is it's only using the hue value. It doesn't care about the darkness. If I go back to the normal mode, you can see no matter what I select in here, I'll select all sorts of different values. As long as they're not pure black or pure white, when I select it back to hue, it's going to look very consistent because it only cares about the hue value. It doesn't care about the level of luminosity or saturation. So the only exception is if I actually made it 0 or white, because that would be no hue. But I'll undo that. Now let's go into a little more detail about hue interacts with black and white images. So I have this layer here, which is kind of a, some type of red, and I'll put it over my ocean here. And let's set it to hue. So you can see it's doing what we saw in the last example. It's coloring the sky. Now if I copy and paste this over the black and white version, you'll see it's having no effect. And this isn't because it's behind the black and white image. You can see this is clearly at the top of the layer stack. If I set it back to normal, you'll see. So I'll go back to hue. So hue has no effect on a black and white image or any part of your image that's black and white because there's no hue information there to begin with. So a question you may ask yourself is there a way around that? The answer is yes, and that's where the color blend mode comes into play. So let's look at that one now. The color blend mode is similar to hue, but it will also add some saturation into the mix, which means it helps us add color to black and white images. So let's look at this example here. I have this blue square. Let me copy it over to the hue section, and I'll set the blend mode to hue. And if you remember on the last section, you can probably predict what will happen. So nothing happens here because this is a black and white image. So let me take that same selection and copy it over my other image. And let's set the blend mode to color. And now you can see the difference. We're actually getting some color effect here. Because what color is doing is it's actually adding in some saturation values too to help us recover some of that hue. One thing I do want to mention is how hue and color act a little bit differently even when the background does have a color to it. So you can see I have these two yellow rectangles here. They're the exact same color. There's RGB up here if you're curious. And the one on the left is set to the hue blend mode and the one on the right is set to the color blend mode. But there is a slight difference between them. You can look at their RGB values to see that. It looks like the color on the right is a little more saturated. So in practice, this might not be a huge difference, but just know that even if your image is in color already, there's a slight difference between how hue and the color blend modes will work. So my recommendation would be experiment with both and see which looks better. So before we move on to the remaining blend modes in this section, I just want to give a brief disclaimer about how they actually work. Now I kind of explained it in simple terms and just said, well, something like the hue layer is going to take the hue of the top layer and just replace the hue of the bottom layer with that. In practice, this isn't really how the hue, saturation, and luminosity blend modes work. We can see this example here. My blend layer has a HSL of 108, 55, 50, so in other words, the hue is 108. And the bottom layer has a HSL of 297, 75, 70. Now, if it was just replacing the hue, you would expect this middle layer to have 108, 75, 70, because it would just be the same as the bottom layer's HSL, but only the hue would be replaced. But what we can see is that actually that's not quite what's happening. Even the saturation and lightness are getting a little bit of an adjustment. So if the hue blend mode was just replacing hue, we would actually expect something like this, 108, 75, 70, but what we're really getting is this. So the reason this happens is because what I talked about earlier, which is our perceived value of the different colors. So what Affinity Photo, Designer, and Publisher are trying to do is they're also adjusting the saturation and lightness to maintain the feeling of the color. And it's actually pretty convenient because in the end it gives you better looking results. But for these HSL modes, if you are expecting it to literally just replace the hue, saturation, or lightness of the layer below it, know that that's actually not the way it's going to work. It's going to make this kind of correction function to make it look a little more pleasing. So with that out of the way, let's look at the saturation blend mode. So what the saturation blend mode is going to do is change the saturation of the layer below it. So I have these examples here of some flowers, and it's a little bit of a dull image. Let's increase the saturation. Well, we can look at a couple different situations. Let's take this black square. Let's kind of cover our image, and I'll set the blend mode to saturation. And you can see it's black and white. That's because our black box had no saturation at all, and it's applying it to the image below it. Let's try this other gray box. I'll set the blend mode to saturation. And again, it's gray. So anything in the grayscale range is just going to make your image black and white. Okay, now let's do the red here. So I'll copy this over and set the blend mode to saturation. Now you can see what this blend mode is actually doing. So we've really heavily saturated our image below it. And maybe this is like really strong, so you can kind of turn it down a little bit. So that's the effect the saturation blend mode is having. Let's do one more example. Let's copy this red and let's set it to blue. So if I put this blue over here, what do you think will happen if I set it to saturation? Well, let's do it. So it turned it red. And remember, this is because this blend mode only cares about the saturation level. It doesn't care that this color is blue. It just cares that it's very saturated. Let me drag it out a little bit. You can see as I go around the color wheel, it's not having any effect on the color. It's just changing the saturation level. So let's look at the luminosity blend mode and we'll see how that behaves. Again, I have some sample squares here, so let's put them over and see what happens. So this is a very white rectangle. Let's see if I go to luminosity. You can definitely see it's making it much brighter below it. And this would be another one where you likely want to change the value of the opacity. So for black, if we cover our image and do luminosity, it's going to be totally black because that's the effect that pure black has for luminosity. And once again, if I do this red here, it's changing it to the value of this color, but the red itself actually has no effect. It's just doing the luminosity value. One cool little touch up we can do with luminosity is use it with a curves adjustment layer. Now I haven't talked too much about adjustment layers in this video, so I'll keep it simple, but this part here is not that complex. With my image selected, I'll click the adjustments here, and I'll add a curves adjustment. And a brief crash course on how this works is left to right represents the value range of my image, and up and down is how I'm going to adjust it. So I can make my brights a little bit brighter up here, and I can make my darks a little bit darker. And this is kind of a classic S-curve for curves adjustments. I think if you understand this process, you know about 90% of what people use curves for. And what I can do is I can set the blend mode to luminosity. I'll close this curves. And it actually has kind of a nice effect on my image. Let me toggle it on and off. So this is before, after, before, after. So that's just a quick trick you can do with luminosity. Add it to a curves adjustment and see if it improves your image. So those are the component blend modes that work with our hue, saturation, and luminosity. And just remember that even though they all independently work with hue, saturation, and luminosity, they do slightly affect each other a little bit just to give that color correction effect. And the difference between hue and color is that hue has no effect on black and white or grayscale parts of an image, whereas color does add hue and saturation to help us recover from black and white parts of an image. So now let's look at the remaining blend modes. Okay, now let's look at what I call the other blend modes, and most of these are unique to the Affinity products. They have varying levels of explanations and documentation online, but we'll look at examples and we'll try to figure out what exactly they're doing. So let's start with average. The average blend mode is one of the simplest to understand. It literally just takes the average value of the blend layers channel and the base layers channel and gives you the result. I haven't seen too many examples of people using average online, but one interesting scenario is using it as another way to add colorization to your image. So I have kind of this autumn scene here. What I could do is I could drag this rectangle over it, and I could set the blend mode to average. Now, like many of the blend modes we've looked at, the default effect is pretty strong, but I can reduce the opacity, so let's do that. I can go to 50%, I can dial it down. So let's toggle on and off and see what it looks like. So this is with on, off, on, off. And it can just be another good way to add some type of color to your image. Now, as I said, the math for the average blend mode is very simple. Here I have my blend layer and my base layer below, and you can see the average of 200 and 100 is 150, the average of 150 and 50 is 100, and so on. Now what's interesting is that average is basically the same as 50% opacity. So another way of thinking of average is that it's a way to change the opacity of your top layer. Negation is going to be very similar to the exclusion blend mode, but it's going to give it a little bit more vibrancy. So let's look at an example here. I have these 3 images and I preset these blend modes below. Let's drag them up. And here we have the end result. You can definitely see that negation is a little more vibrant and saturated. Let me move around these colors and you can see how it's actually having a different effect. I actually think negation actually looks pretty cool in a lot of examples, more so than exclusion, which tends to look a little muddier to me. So if you're looking for a negative image effect or something where you were using exclusion or difference, I think negation is one that's definitely worth checking out. Contrast negate definitely looks kind of weird at first. You can't really see what the purpose of it is. There's a lot of thresholding effects, but there's also this kind of desaturated middle area here in the grayscale part. So what is the purpose of contrast negate? Well, one really interesting scenario for contrast negate is with text. We can use it to actually help emphasize text against the background. So I have this text layer here and it's just normal blend mode now. Let me drag it over this black and white area. And of course you can see it's not very readable. However, if I select the contrast negate blend mode, you can see it actually contrasts better with the background. So no matter where I move the text, it's actually pretty readable. We can actually do a similar thing with colored text. So let's put this over here. And you can see with the contrast negate blend mode, the text is much more contrasting with the background, even if I select different colors for it. So this is one where if you're doing some type of graphic design and you have text that's running across different colored backgrounds, it might be useful to check out contrast negate. Now let's look at reflect and glow together. These are 2 separate blend modes, but they're both pretty cool and I think it's nice to compare them side by side. They definitely fall into that category of just try them and see what kind of cool stuff happens. So let me select my squares here, and this one on the left here is set to reflect and this one is set to the glow blend mode. I'll move them over the image. And you can see what's happening in this black and white example. They're both definitely adding some color to the image below it. Reflect seems to preserve the blacks more, whereas glow is adding color even in the black areas. Let's change the colors and see what happens. So I can put it to this pink. Adjusting saturation definitely has an effect there. You can see that on the glow side, the whiter parts even took on a lot of the hue of our blend layer. What I think is interesting about glow is you can see that sometimes we do get the white there, but if we go to saturated, it'll go more on the dark side. Let's see how reflect and glow behave with colored images. So I'll do the same thing here. Let's drag these over. Once again, we can see with glow, the hue is really dominating the image, whereas with reflect, we're still getting more of the original colors, but they're just much more saturated and bright. If we move around, we can see the same result we got with the black and white image. And again, what I like about glow is sometimes you see that we get the bright whites, but if we adjust it slightly, they can actually disappear a little bit. Now, of course, with all of this, we can adjust the opacity because it's pretty extreme here. You can kind of set the opacity to what you want. But I like the 100% just for this demo. So some of these effects look like really interesting filters that could be applied to your image. One other thing you can do is apply the image to itself. So I copied the image here, but I set the blend mode to reflect and here the blend mode to glow. Note that it's having no effect on a white background. But if I move them over their original images, they're actually pretty similar looking. But like I said earlier in this video, one good test you can do for blend modes is to copy the image and just apply it onto itself with the blend mode you're experimenting with. So that's a quick summary of reflect and glow. They're kind of at the bottom of the blend options list, but I recommend giving them a try, especially with some solid colors over an image. If you have some type of night scene with fancy neon lights or something like that, it can look really cool. So for our final blend mode, let's look at the erase blend mode. So let's say I have this image here of a city, and maybe I want to put the title over some backdrop here, and I want the title to be cut out of this square. So I have a rectangle here. I just have my image of a city below, and then I have my text. Well, one thing we can do is we can use the erase mode, and that'll cause our text to be cut out of the shape and we can see the sky behind it. So let's do that. I have my text selected. We'll go all the way to the bottom and I'll select erase. And you can see what happened isn't quite what we want. It's white. And the reason it's white is because it's literally erasing through everything in our image to show us the white background. Now, probably that's not what we want in most cases. How do we actually isolate this effect to make it so we're actually just erasing this square and seeing the sky behind it? Well, in this scenario, what you can do is you can group the text and the rectangle. So let me group them. I'll hit Control G. And now you can see we're actually getting the effect we want. Let me move this group around. You can see that we can actually see through the text. And the reason this is happening is because within our group, the Boston text is just erasing the layer below it. It's not actually going through the whole image. And the nice thing about this is it's non-destructive, so if I want to change my text to something else, I could easily do that. Just call it river. And as I drag my group around, it's still totally transparent. If I wanted, I could add some other types of shapes to cut out. So I'll put it in here. I'll select the blend mode to erase. Let me move it up here. So erase is one of those tools that you can have in your toolbox. It's kind of related to masking and clipping layers, kind of when you want to have things take a certain shape. And just remember that if you want to limit the range of the erase effect, put it in a group. So those are all the blend modes in Affinity programs with lots of information that will carry over to other software too. And of course, if you have any comments or questions, leave them below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.